Hello everyone, I am Neel. Welcome to my channel Horror Fang. We are going to narrate to you some selected horror stories of your choice as well as ours. The email ID is given in the description box. If you have a story, please mail it and get a chance for your story to be narrated by us. Today we are here with you with a scary part of Anita Krishan's Unfinished Party from the book The Ghost of the Silent Hills. Before proceeding towards the story, please like the video if you like it and share and subscribe. So here we move on with it. Pa got busy winding up his work at the institute and Ma got busy packing up. Since the east wing of the main building was still occupied by us, Pa decided to temporarily arrange for the new principal's stay at the cottage. The cottage was situated about 50 meters southeast of the main building, bordering a dark coniferous forest. A downhill incline hidden under a bounty of firs and cedars began right from the rear end of the cottage. It was a snug unit of a large sitting room, 2 comfortable bedrooms, a kitchen and a bath. A well-kept garden in front of it imparted it a quaint picture of a typical English house. During the erstwhile rule of the British, this cottage seemed to have accommodated the manager of the hotel. Its isolation was ominous. In the beginning of his tenure, Pa had offered it to the vice principal, but he had barely stayed there for 2 days, at the end of which he requested to be lodged in the main building. "I am single and need only a small unit to stay," he justified. Even using the cottage on a shared basis was not acceptable to anyone. Why no one wanted to stay in the cottage, Pa never gave it much thought, for he had no clue that rumors were rife in the school about a mysterious presence in the cottage. Consequently, the cottage got reserved for special guests of the institute. It was opened once in a while for cleaning, but mostly remained vacant and locked. Now the cottage was opened after months for a thorough cleaning to make it livable for the new principal and his wife. Ballab, a young boy in his late teens who had joined the staff only 2 months ago, was assigned the duty. Equipped with cleaners, brooms, mops and dusters, Ballab opened the lock and entered the cottage around 9 in the morning. The house was icy cold and oddly dissuading. The moment he started his work, he began to hear strange whispers. Was the broom he was using making funny sounds? He stood still, but the whispers persisted. He realized that the voices were coming from behind him. He looked around, wondering who else was in the cottage. Had someone sneaked in as he had left the door ajar for fresh air? He inspected the rooms but found no one. He resumed his work, ignoring the murmurs, but they were getting louder. The sounds kept following him. He shivered inside his warm clothing. After sweeping the floors, he sat on a chair to rest. The murmurs were draining him. He pressed and released his ears a number of times to stop the buzzing. Slowly the sound subsided. Perhaps he needed to see a doctor. After resting for 5 minutes, he got up to resume his work. The whispers immediately returned. He tried ignoring the strange voices, but they were getting stronger. Then he heard the first clear sounds. "Get out!" He looked around. Perhaps the voice had leaked in through the window, though he couldn't spot anyone outside. Shaking his head, he walked into the bedroom and picked up the bed cover to change the bed linen. It was then that he felt a strong shove. He held onto the side table. "Get out!" The angry, growling voice was near and distinct. Someone seemed to be standing right next to him, totally invisible. He stood frozen, looking around the empty, stark room. Then he watched in horror as the pillow from the bed rose on its own and came hurtling towards him. He dodged, and then panting, trembling and screaming, gasping, he rushed out of the cottage and straight into the principal's office. Pa patiently listened to Ballab's story. His shivering body and pale face were proof that he had actually experienced something that intensely scared him. But pillows hurtling through the air on their own? The boy had surely a fabulous imagination. Nevertheless, for a moment, Pa got worried. Were there really supernatural activities happening around? First Nandi and now Ballab. But he shook this thought out of his mind. the boy was exaggerating. He was barely 18 and immature. He summoned Vishnu in charge of maintenance and asked him to stay with Ballav till he has finished his work. Ballav refused outright. Nothing could pursue him to return to the cottage. The experience had unnerved Ballav so intensely that he asked to be relieved from his job. He would go home and later seek a job elsewhere. "This place is spooky, sir, not safe," he declared. Pa rubbished the whole episode as fictitious fear of a weak-minded juvenile and allowed him to leave. Vishnu was equally hesitant to enter the cottage. He had heard that the paranormal activity around the cottage had increased lately, but he couldn't decline the orders. He collected a team of a few bravers, including Jhaku. They first scouted the cottage, loudly chanting prayers. The cottage had never felt that cold. They also felt an unexplained presence, as if someone was keenly watching them, following them, yet keeping distance. Perhaps prayers were working. Cleaning the cottage hurriedly, they locked it once again. 2 days before my family was to depart for Shimla, Mr. and Mrs. Kulkarni arrived a little before lunchtime. The sky was partly cloudy and the balmy sunshine repressed the feel of the approaching summers. But for the couple, having come from the summer heat of Delhi, it was almost like experiencing winter again. The Kulkarnis were in the late 30s and childless. The excitement of being posted at a famous building sitting in the lap of the Himalayas was writ large on their faces. The institute's staff and students had gathered to extend them a hearty welcome. "This is our first time on the mountains and we are going to love it here," Mr. Kulkarni announced heartily, and his wife nodded enthusiastically, wrapping her shawl around her. They both seemed like school children going for a picnic. They shrilled at the prospect of living in such heavenly surroundings exuded from their very mannerism. A few staff members exchanged glances. Some shook their heads in pity. Jhaku and Vishnu, standing at the back of the group, bowed their heads and said silent prayers. After the initial welcome, introductions and hot cups of the tea, the couple settled in the cottage. "What a lovely little joint," Mrs. Kulkarni remarked, plonking herself on the sitting room sofa. "Except it's exceptionally cold in here," Mr. Kulkarni added, rubbing his hands to warm them. "I know. I felt it as soon as I entered. I have asked the caretaker to keep the heaters on." After freshening up, the couple joined my parents for lunch. Mrs. Kulkarni, happy and excited, twittered throughout. Afterwards, they were taken to the garden for a relaxed cup of coffee. Mrs. Kulkarni looked around in awe at the emerald glass and the exotic flowers in the beds, which had just begun to bloom. She seemed impressed and expressed her excitement to my mother. "Mrs. Sharma, I don't mind living here for the rest of my life. This place is heavenly, just out of the world. Aren't you sad you're leaving?" "We have always lived in similar places, Mrs. Kulkarni. We belong to the mountains and we aren't going far, just about 20 kilometers away." "You are so lucky," Mrs. Kulkarni chirped. Pa interrupted the conversation to suggest that Kulkarnis should shift to the main building after our departure. But Mrs. Kulkarni was too happy with the charming cottage. "Why do we need a large accommodation? We don't have children. The cottage is big enough for the two of us and quite comfortable. I'll enjoy my privacy and peace there." "Absolutely your choice." Papa shrugged his shoulders. "But may I warn you, it can get lonely at times." He was anxious for their well-being after the recent incidents, even as he pretended to be a skeptic. But Mrs. Kulkarni rubbished his proposal. "I have suffered enough noise of the crowded cities. Now I want to enjoy peace of the isolated cottage." She cheerfully stretched her legs and added, "I am thoroughly going to enjoy the tranquility of this stunning mountain resort. Did you say it was once a luxury hotel during the British era?" Mr. Kulkarni watched his wife devotedly. He was clearly pleased at her being so happy. After lunch, Pa and Mr. Kulkarni left for the office. Ma advised Mrs. Kulkarni to rest for the afternoon. She needed it after the long journey. But the novelty of the place had given the lady extra agility. She spent the entire afternoon inspecting the gardens, the surrounding areas, and basking in the sun. It was only late in the evening that she entered the cottage. By now, darkness had begun to creep in as softly as a prowling predator. waning Mrs. Kulkarni's zeal. The calls of the nocturnal creatures caused further dismay. She was a typical city-bred who had only seen crowds at clamor. The hush of the forlorn mountain dampened her spirit. On top of this, she had begun to hear strange whispers. Were there people outside, students or staff talking in bushed voice? But the sound seemed to be coming from inside the cottage. She quickly took out Lord Krishna's idol from her bag, selected a prayer corner and sat down for her evening puja, earnestly waiting for her husband's return. When the couple joined my family for dinner, her concern was quite apparent. Don't you ever feel scared living in this forsaken place? Her paradoxical statement amused Mom. Don't worry, you will soon get used to it. After dinner, the couple returned to the cottage as the long journey and the hectic activities of the day had worn them out. They went to bed around 10 and the long day's tiredness immediately overtook their conscious minds. Sometime at midnight, Mrs. Kulkarni woke up with a jolt. Something had woken her up from a deep sleep. She couldn't be sure of what it was. There was absolute stillness around now. Ghastly stillness. The only sound she could hear was coming through the window of rustling leaves in a mild breeze. She had never in her entire life experienced such intense silence where one could even hear the sound of a soft breeze. Though she had a hunch that it was louder that had woken her up. Someone had spoken to her almost into her ears. An angry voice. Maybe it was a dream. Her husband suddenly muttered in his sleep. He then began thrashing his arms around, trying to lash out at something. That was strange. In their married life of 14 years, he had never done that. She sat up alarmed. Honey, what's wrong? She asked tenderly, but then he calmed down. He was probably very tired and anxious about his new job. Dismissing her anxiety as needless and not wanting to disturb him, she softly got out of her bed to go to the bathroom. She switched on a small torch that she had kept on the bedside table. As she neared the bathroom door, she felt something brush past her. Distinctly. Someone had been in her way, and as she had approached the bathroom door, it had moved to a side to let her pass. In the torchlight, she tried to pry around. Perhaps a cat had got inside the cottage. Wondering at the strange sensation, she went to use the toilet. She still inside when she heard her husband's annoyed voice telling someone not to trouble him. Who was he speaking to? She hurried back. This time she decided to switch on the table lamp. Mr. Kulkarni was wide awake. She chided her for pulling at his blanket and now switching on the light. What's wrong with you? I'm tired. I have plenty of work to do in the morning, he grumbled. She opened her mouth to explain, but he persisted. I deserve to be allowed some decent sleep. He then pulled the blanket exasperatedly over his face and turned his back towards her. Mrs. Kulkarni was surprised at this unjustified ticking. She hadn't even ventured near his bed. Annoyed, she switched off the light and slipped into her bed. The moment the cool darkness returned to the room, she distinctly heard some faint sound. There was something in the cottage. Could be a cat, she reiterated her thought. But why would he pull at her husband's blanket? She couldn't sleep anymore. The penetrating silence began to get on her nerves. Perhaps accepting this posting at such an isolated place was not a good idea. But then they had no idea it would be so desolate. She mused in the deathly silence of the night. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. The bathroom door groaned at the hinges. Her eyes flew wide open. Her heart jumped against her ribs. She had shut the door just a few minutes ago. She turned to check on her husband. Still with his back towards her, he was packed in his blanket and blissfully asleep. Then who had opened the bathroom door? She turned her head towards the door. Her heartbeat stopped. It was wide open now. Someone was standing there facing her. Faint moonlight seeping through the curtains of the room revealed a flimsy womanish figure in a flowering dress. But no more. Sound would emerge from her throat. She began to shake frenziedly. Was she dreaming? She shut and opened her eyes. The spectre was gone. She had perceived two frightful eyes, two dark holes staring at her, chilling her to her bones. But now a black hollowness inside a rectangular frame of the open door stared back at her. Who was she? Did I really see someone? Or was it just my imagination? My God, I'm going mad in this isolation. Then sounds from outside began to trickle in, faint and feeble. There were sounds of the tables being laid and some distant voices. She heard clinking of glasses followed by more sounds in unison, like some toast being offered. There were more distinct noises, and after that the next sound was absolutely clear. Some said, "Bera, chai lao." A woman's voice followed, "Bera, idhar aao." Sound of faint laughter could be heard now. The voices had a distinct British accent. Perhaps these two people are closest to the cottage. Nevertheless, sounds were soothing to her ears. At least there was some human company. She could now hear waltz music in the distance. Then she heard a male voice, "Daphne, dance with me." Her mind began to work in a different direction. She was sure that some party was going on, from which she and her husband had been excluded. That upset her. When she was at dinner, no one had mentioned a late-night party to be held, yet not even a hint. Who were these people? She had spent almost the entire day and hadn't seen any foreigners. She couldn't contain herself and voiced her opinion loudly to her husband and woke him up again. "Dear, there's a party going on outside." "I know. I hear them. Perhaps the visitors arrive late at night." Mr. Kulkarni responded sleepily. "Please sleep and let me sleep, dear." Mrs. Kulkarni considered her husband's opinion for a while, and to her it seemed like an explanation for the late night party. This was also a matter of worry. Her husband and she were modest people, not at all the party-going types. Had never touched alcohol in their lives. This place still seems under the British influence, though most of the British left the country 10 years ago. Maybe some still lived here, around this place. She lay in her bed, wide awake, reflecting. Lost in these thoughts, she began to drift into sleep. The sounds continued for a while. She had no idea for how long, and then slowly began to fade. Mrs. Kulkarni finally fell into a deep rested sleep. Next morning was unlike the previous one. Cobalt sky and cheerful sunshine welcomed the residents. Kulkarnis were up early, tired and drained. The cottage didn't appear as cheerful as it had the previous day. There was an eerie sadness floating in and filling the space. After the morning course and the puja, the couple headed towards the main building. They wanted to eat their breakfast in the hostel mess, but they did not want any burden to my mother. But Ma insisted that they should lunch with them, and they humbly accepted her invitation. After breakfast, Mr. Kulkarni joined Pa in the office. Mrs. Kulkarni did not go back to the cottage. Her sixth sense was dissuading her from being there alone. The spectre that she had seen momentarily last night was still unnerving her, though she was still confused whether it was real or just a misgiving. So she whiled away her morning by strolling in the terraced gardens around the main building. Ma had been very busy since the morning as we were to leave for our new destination the next day. She had once peeped through the window and had seen Mrs. Kulkarni sitting alone in the garden, looking lost. Since her packing was more or less over, Ma walked down to spend some time with the ladies. She also arranged for 2 cups of tea to be sent to them. Mrs. Kulkarni was too happy to have her company. The ladies fell into normal chit-chat about their families. Tea arrived. Mrs. Kulkarni took a sip of the hot beverage and then kept the cup on the table. She hesitated and then raised the topic of the late-night party to which she hadn't been invited. "How was last night's party, Mrs. Sharma? Is it customary to give late-night parties here?" "No. What party are you talking about?" Ma stared at her puzzled. "Perhaps the student had a party last night." Ma frowned and shook her head. She had been staying here for over a year and had no knowledge about any such activity having taken place the previous night, or, for that matter, on any other night, at least not since she had been here. Mrs. Kulkarni, there has never been any late night parties within the premises of this institute. My husband is not the type to arrange or even allow such parties. Seeing a mystified expression on her face, Ma continued. Wildflower Hall was a hotel once, when British ruled over us. They used to have parties here, enjoying life at the expense of us, native Indians. But that's all over now. Mrs. Kulkarni had gone pale. She even shivered beneath her jumper and shawl. Ma continued. Though we do have formal get-togethers to celebrate festivals, Holi, Diwali, or evening high teas for the guests once in a while, nothing more than that. Never. Yesterday night there wasn't any party, neither at evening nor at night. Ma settled and Mrs. Kulkarni's doubt with finality and took a few sips of tea. Mrs. Kulkarni stared at Ma with anxiety bordering conflict. Ma was unable to understand what was the matter with her. Was she somewhat crazy? There was complete silence for a while. Ma noted her wiping beads of sweat that had collected on her temples and wondered why she was so worked up. The staff and students have arranged for a farewell party for us in the evening, and of course you both will be our special guests. Ma tried cheering her up. That didn't help in easing Mrs. Kulkarni's anxiety. Ma watched her looking around dazed, her eyes wide with fright. Then her eyes came to rest on the huge oak tree growing close to the bedroom window of the cottage. It was a massive tree, had presumably been there for centuries. She turned back to Ma. Mrs. Sharma, there was definitely a party yesterday night, he asserted rather vividly now. There were lots of sounds of clattering of crockery, clinking of glasses, and foreigners calling out to waiters to serve them. Bera chai lao. I very clearly heard someone ordering. There was also music and dance, and there was also a woman called Daphne. I clearly heard this all happening last night. There is no question of being confused. It was Ma's turn to stare at Mrs. Kulkarni, dumbfounded. What was she blabbering about? Party outside in the middle of the night? And English people? Where do you think the party was held? Ma asked her softly, now obviously a little anxious. She once again regarded the old oak tree. Her eyes narrowed. She appeared confused and distressed. Turning towards the building as if trying to make up her mind, she finally concluded. It was somewhere around that large tree, that one close to the cottage bedroom window. But then, why would anyone have a party outside the cottage? That doesn't make sense. She turns towards Ma with a solid conviction. It must be outside the main building then. Ma was getting irritated at her persistence. Mrs. Kulkarni, just think, who would arrange a party in the lawns on a cold night? Wouldn't it be practical to have an indoor party? We have a big and delightful dining hall for this purpose. It was once meant for ballroom dancing for the British. She added with vehemence. Besides, do you see any signs of any... The lady was stumped. Mrs. Kulkarni, your tea has gone cold. Let me go and order a fresh cup for you. No, please no, don't go. She pleaded and shivered. I even saw a woman in the cottage in the middle of the night. She stood at the bathroom door and then was gone. Her voice trailed away. She anxiously looked at Ma to see her reaction. Ma gasped and then decided there was no point discussing such things. She felt pity for the lady who was clearly delusional. It was all a figment of her imagination, though Nandi's spooky experience too hovered at the back of Ma's mind. She then changed the topic. Make sure you have enough warm clothes, Miss Kulkarni. Thick overcoats and woolen scarves. Winters here are quite severe. Not receiving any response, she continued. We can meet in Shimla one day and I can help you shop for the winter essentials. Mrs. Kulkarni nodded mildly. But summers are beautiful here. Putting her empty teacup on the table, Ma declared. And in this season, you'll also find good cheese growing on the slopes. They are the most expensive mushrooms, as costly as silver. She laughed to ease the tension but realized that Mrs. Kulkarni wasn't listening. She was continuously and anxiously surveying the surroundings. After spending half an hour with her when Ma left to go back to her work, the lady was staring at the cold oak, utterly confounded. An hour later, when they were together for lunch, Mrs. Kulkarni once again broached the subject of the previous night's party. Mr. Kulkarni seconded her report of the events. Although he had been very tired and sleepy, a few things had disturbed him. Firstly, it was my wife stroking my face and waking me up from my deep sleep, as if we were on a honeymoon. He vowed. And then she kept tugging at my blanket. He turned to smile at his wife. What had come upon you last night, honey? You never ever did that before, not even when we were newly married. His wife stared at him blankly, baffled and scared, and embarrassed at his flagrant cheeks. What are you saying, dear? I never touched your blanket last night. I didn't even come near your bed, not even once. She then drew in her breath. The night scene played on her mind yet again. The apparition of a woman at the bathroom door staring at her. There was a third unknown presence in the room. She was sure now, though she had a vision of a spectre in her room. She now assumed that talking about it might fetch her ridicule. Except for Ma, nobody understood why she was suddenly looked terribly startled. Thank you guys. If you like the video, please like, share and subscribe. We need your support, and of course, one like means a lot of things. It is the only consolation which we receive on working hard and continuously for this story, and we will keep on bringing such horror stories and make you frightened. Thank you. Goodbye.